For millions of older Americans who legally own firearms, something major just happened, and the effects could reach every corner of the country. The Supreme Court has issued a unanimous 9-0 decision that is already sending shockwaves through legal circles, law enforcement agencies, and gun owner communities nationwide. And here's what has people paying attention. Every single justice agreed. No split, no deadlock, no uncertainty inside the courtroom. 9 justices looked at the issue and came to the same conclusion. That alone makes this ruling important, because unanimous Supreme Court decisions are rare, especially when firearms and constitutional rights are involved. But what's making this story even bigger is the concern about who could be most affected. Legal analysts say older gun owners, especially those over 60, may need to pay close attention to what happens next. Not because the court directly targeted seniors, it didn't, but because millions of older Americans fall into the exact category most likely to feel the impact of how this ruling changes firearm law moving forward. And right now, across the country, people are trying to understand what exactly changed. Because like many major Supreme Court rulings, the answer is more complicated than a simple headline. The court did not suddenly ban firearms. It did not erase the Second Amendment. And it did not create a nationwide confiscation order. What it did was something far more powerful. It clarified how firearm laws should be interpreted, and who has the authority to create major regulations. That distinction matters a lot, because for years, one of the biggest debates in American gun law has focused on federal agencies and how much power they have. Agencies often create regulations by interpreting laws already passed by Congress. They take broad legal language and apply it to new situations, new firearm technologies, new accessories, new classifications, new enforcement standards. And over time, those interpretations can become extremely influential. Sometimes they affect millions of people without Congress ever voting on a brand new law directly. That process has frustrated many gun owners for years, especially older Americans who have watched regulations change repeatedly over decades. One administration interprets the rules one way, another administration changes course, and suddenly, something that was once considered legal enters a legal gray area. That uncertainty has led to lawsuits across the country, challenges claiming agencies exceeded their authority, challenges arguing that major firearm restrictions require direct approval from Congress. Eventually, one of those challenges reached the Supreme Court. And now, after reviewing the case, the justices have spoken unanimously. The court made it clear that federal agencies cannot create major policy changes without clear authorization from Congress. Not assumptions, not broad interpretations, not vague language stretched into entirely new meanings. Clear authorization. That was the core message. And the reason this matters so much is because many firearm-related regulations over the years relied heavily on agency interpretation. Some involved technical definitions, others involved classifications of certain firearms or accessories, and some involved enforcement rules that changed depending on who controlled the executive branch. Now, legal experts are asking a critical question. If those regulations were built mainly on interpretation, can they survive under this new Supreme Court standard? That's where the nationwide implications begin. Because if lower courts apply this ruling aggressively, numerous firearm regulations could face new legal challenges, and older gun owners may feel especially affected because many have owned firearms legally for decades under changing regulatory systems. They've seen rules evolve before, but this ruling could trigger something bigger than ordinary policy shifts. It could change the legal foundation itself. Now, here's why analysts keep mentioning Americans over 60 specifically. Statistics consistently show that older Americans make up a huge portion of lawful firearm owners in the United States. Many keep firearms for personal protection, others for hunting, sport shooting, collecting, or family traditions passed down across generations. And unlike younger owners who may have entered the system recently, Older gun owners have often experienced multiple waves of changing firearm regulations over the years. That means they are especially sensitive to legal uncertainty, especially when courts begin redefining how regulations are created and enforced. Now, it's important to understand something clearly. This ruling does not automatically invalidate every firearm regulation in America. That's not how Supreme Court decisions work. Instead, the court established a legal framework, a standard that lower courts must now use when evaluating future challenges. And that framework could become extremely powerful over time, because attorneys across the country are already reviewing regulations they believe may now be vulnerable. They are identifying rules that depend heavily on agency interpretation. They are preparing new lawsuits, and they are building arguments directly around this unanimous Supreme Court decision. That process could take years, but the impact may begin much sooner. Because once uncertainty enters the legal system, reactions spread quickly. Federal agencies begin reviewing policies. Law enforcement departments review procedures. State governments reassess local regulations. And courts begin reevaluating older cases using the new standard. That chain reaction has already started. Now, another reason this ruling is receiving so much attention is because unanimous decisions carry extraordinary weight. A 5-4 ruling suggests division. A 6-3 ruling suggests ideological disagreement. But a 9-0 ruling sends a very different signal. It tells lower courts that the Supreme Court sees this issue as legally clear. And when lower courts receive that kind of message, they often respond seriously. That's why legal experts believe this ruling could influence future firearm cases across all 50 states, not because the court ruled on every law directly, but because the reasoning behind the decision may now shape countless future challenges. And those challenges may not stop with firearms. Because this case is also about government authority overall, environmental regulations, healthcare rules, financial oversight, any area where federal agencies interpret laws could eventually feel the effects. That's why constitutional scholars are paying close attention. Some believe this ruling marks part of a broader shift in how the Supreme Court views federal power. A shift toward requiring clearer approval from Congress before agencies can impose major national policies. If that trend continues, the effects could spread far beyond gun laws. Now, reactions outside the courtroom have been intense. Gun rights organizations are celebrating the decision. They argue it restores constitutional balance and prevents unelected agencies from effectively creating laws on their own. Some are even calling it one of the most important firearm-related rulings in years. On the other side, gun control advocates are expressing serious concern. They warn that limiting agency flexibility could make it harder to respond quickly to emerging firearm technologies and changing public safety concerns. They argue that Congress often moves too slowly to address fast-changing situations, and without agency flexibility, they fear dangerous gaps may emerge. Both sides understand the same reality, though. This decision matters a lot. Because once the Supreme Court changes the legal framework around regulatory authority, the effects rarely stay contained. They spread through the courts, through agencies, through legislation, and eventually into everyday life. Now, another major concern is how different lower courts may interpret the ruling moving forward. Some judges may apply the decision narrowly, others may interpret it broadly. That could create different outcomes in different parts of the country. One court may uphold a regulation, another may strike down a nearly identical one. And when federal courts disagree like that, the Supreme Court often has to step in again later to resolve the conflict. That possibility is exactly why many analysts believe this story is far from over. This unanimous ruling may not be the end of the legal battle. It may be the beginning of a much larger one. A battle over the limits of federal power, the future of firearm regulation, and the balance between agency authority and constitutional rights. For older Americans watching this unfold, that uncertainty feels significant. Many have spent decades following firearm laws carefully, registering weapons where required, complying with changing regulations, adjusting to evolving standards. Now they're hearing that the legal structure behind some of those rules may be changing again. That naturally creates concern. Not panic, but concern. Because when constitutional law shifts, even slightly, millions of people begin asking the same question. What happens next? Right now, nobody has a complete answer. The courts are still sorting through the implications. Agencies are still reviewing their policies, and attorneys are still preparing the next wave of litigation. But one thing is already clear. This ruling has changed the conversation. The debate over firearm regulation is entering a new phase. A phase shaped not only by politics, but by constitutional limits on government authority itself. And as that phase unfolds, the effects could reach far beyond what most people realize today. Because major Supreme Court rulings don't just affect one case. They reshape the legal landscape, slowly, steadily, case by case, until eventually, the entire system begins to adapt. That process has now begun, and millions of Americans, especially older gun owners, who have lived through decades of changing regulations, are watching very closely, because they understand something important. When the Supreme Court speaks unanimously, the country listens. And now, as the legal world begins reacting to this unanimous Supreme Court decision, the real consequences are starting to come into focus. And for millions of Americans over 60, the uncertainty may be just beginning. Because this ruling didn't simply settle one isolated dispute. It changed the way courts may evaluate firearm regulations moving forward. And when the legal standard changes at the highest level, every lower court in the country has to pay attention. That's exactly what's happening right now. Federal judges are already reviewing pending cases through the lens of this new ruling. Attorneys are filing new motions. Advocacy groups are preparing fresh legal challenges. And agencies that once felt confident about their authority are now being forced to reevaluate how secure that authority really is. For older gun owners, this moment feels especially important because many have spent years trying to stay compliant with constantly changing rules. Some have legally owned the same firearms for decades. Others have collections passed down through generations. Many rely on firearms for personal protection, particularly retirees who live alone or in rural areas where law enforcement response times can be long. And now, after years of evolving regulations, the Supreme Court has effectively signaled that some of the legal foundations behind those regulations may not be as strong as previously believed. That doesn't mean every rule disappears tomorrow, but it does mean future court battles could become far more aggressive. Already, attorneys are identifying regulations they believe were created primarily through agency interpretation rather than direct congressional approval. And according to the court's new framework, that distinction matters enormously because the justices made something very clear. Major policy decisions require clear authorization from Congress, not broad assumptions, not flexible interpretations stretched over time. Clear authorization. That principle now sits at the center of future legal arguments, and those arguments could eventually reshape how firearm laws are enforced nationwide. Now, another reason this ruling is causing such intense reaction is because of how unusual unanimous decisions are in major constitutional disputes. A divided court often signals uncertainty, but a 9-0 ruling carries a very different level of authority. It tells lower courts that the Supreme Court sees the legal issue as fundamentally clear, and lower courts tend to respond carefully when they receive that message. That's why many experts believe this ruling may influence dozens of future cases, even beyond the original dispute itself. Because once a constitutional framework is established unanimously, attorneys begin applying it everywhere they can. That process has already begun. Gun rights organizations are actively reviewing existing federal regulations for possible legal weaknesses. Some are preparing challenges targeting classifications and restrictions they believe relied too heavily on agency authority. Meanwhile, agencies themselves are reviewing internal policies behind closed doors. Officials are asking difficult questions. Which regulations are directly supported by congressional law? Which ones depend mainly on administrative interpretation? Which policies are now vulnerable? And perhaps most importantly, how should enforcement proceed while the legal landscape remains uncertain? That uncertainty matters because confusion inside the legal system can spread quickly into everyday life. Law enforcement agencies rely on clear guidance. Courts rely on stable legal standards. Citizens rely on predictable rules. But when a major Supreme Court decision changes the framework beneath those rules, adjustment becomes unavoidable. And adjustments often take time. Now, another factor making this especially important for Americans over 60 is simple demographics. Older Americans represent one of the largest groups of lawful firearm owners in the country. Many purchased firearms decades ago under completely different regulatory environments. Some inherited weapons through family estates. Others built collections legally over years when regulations were interpreted differently than they are today. That means many older owners have already experienced multiple legal changes throughout their lifetime. Background checks expanded, definitions evolved, regulations shifted from administration to administration. And through it all, many tried carefully to remain compliant with the law. Now they are hearing that the Supreme Court itself is questioning how some regulations were created in the first place. That naturally creates concern about what future changes could follow. Some fear stricter congressional action may eventually emerge in response. Others believe the ruling could weaken federal restrictions over time. And right now, nobody knows exactly which direction the system will move. That uncertainty is the story. Not immediate confiscation, not instant deregulation, uncertainty. Because uncertainty creates legal battles, and legal battles create change. Now, outside the courtroom, political reactions are growing stronger. Some lawmakers are praising the ruling as a victory for constitutional accountability. They argue that unelected agencies should never have the power to impose major firearm policies without direct approval from Congress. Others are warning that the decision could weaken the government's ability to respond quickly to evolving firearm technologies and public safety concerns. And that disagreement reflects a much deeper national divide, a divide that has existed for decades. How should America balance constitutional gun rights with public safety concerns? Who should make those decisions? Congress? Federal agencies? The courts? This ruling doesn't fully answer every part of that debate, but it clearly changes the balance of authority, and that's why the implications could reach far beyond firearms alone. Legal scholars are already pointing out that this decision may influence other areas of government regulation too. Environmental policy, healthcare oversight, financial regulations, any field where agencies interpret broad congressional language could eventually feel the ripple effects. Because the court's message was larger than one firearm case, the message was about limits on administrative power itself. And when the Supreme Court starts redefining those limits, the consequences can last for generations. Now, another major question is how quickly new lawsuits may move through the system. Some legal experts believe challenges could appear almost immediately. Others believe courts will move cautiously while they study the full implications of the ruling. Either way, more litigation is coming. That part seems almost certain. And eventually, conflicting lower court decisions may emerge. One appeals court may interpret the ruling broadly. Another may apply it narrowly. That could create legal inconsistencies between regions of the country. And when federal courts split like that, the Supreme Court often steps in again to resolve the disagreement. Which means this unanimous decision may not be the final chapter. It may only be the first. For millions of older gun owners, that possibility carries enormous significance. Because many are not just concerned about current regulations. They're concerned about stability, predictability, knowing the rules, understanding what changes and what stays the same. And right now, stability is exactly what the legal system lacks. Not because the court created chaos intentionally, but because major constitutional rulings always trigger periods of adjustment. The system has to absorb the decision. Lower courts have to interpret it. Agencies have to respond. And lawmakers have to decide whether new legislation is necessary. That process can take years, sometimes decades. But while the process unfolds, uncertainty remains. Now here's something else many people are overlooking. This ruling also changes future strategy inside Washington itself. Congress may now face greater pressure to write laws more clearly and specifically. Because if agencies can no longer rely on broad interpretation authority as easily as before, lawmakers may have to spell out policies directly. That could reshape how future firearm legislation is written. More detailed language, more precise definitions, and potentially more political battles during the legislative process itself. Because once agencies lose flexibility, Congress inherits more responsibility. And firearm legislation has never been easy territory politically. At the same time, agencies may become more cautious moving forward. Officials may hesitate before issuing aggressive new interpretations, knowing courts could strike them down under this new constitutional framework. That caution alone could change how federal firearm policy evolves in the future. All of these effects are connected. The courts, Congress, federal agencies, law enforcement, gun owners, each part of the system responds to the others. And when the Supreme Court changes one part of the framework, the entire structure begins adjusting around it. That adjustment is happening right now, quietly in some places, loudly in others, but everywhere, people are paying attention, because they understand something important. A unanimous Supreme Court ruling is never just another legal headline. It signals something deeper, a shift, a direction, a message about how constitutional authority should work moving forward. And for millions of Americans over 60 who have spent decades navigating changing firearm laws, that message feels personal. Not because every answer is clear today, but because the future suddenly feels less certain than it did before. As more cases emerge, as more courts weigh in, and as Congress and federal agencies respond, the true impact of this ruling will slowly become clearer. But right now, one thing is undeniable. The legal landscape surrounding firearms in America has entered a new phase. A phase shaped by constitutional limits on government power. A phase that could redefine how regulations are created and enforced for years to come. And a phase that millions of gun owners are now watching very, very closely.